If you had the opportunity to talk with one of your literary heroes, what would you ask them? What would you do? How would you feel? Understandably, you might be extremely nervous. I know I would be. In fact, I was. Back in November, I had the opportunity to talk with the Doctor of Fantasy himself, A.P. Canavan.
Hi, I'm Dr. A.P. Canavan.
Perhaps you've never heard of him, and this would be why. Are there any past projects you've worked on that you're especially proud of?
Yes.
Could you elaborate?
No.
In addition to university teaching and a freelance editing practice, AP also hosts the wonderful YouTube channel A Critical Dragon,
where I talk about narrative, where I do close readings, where I talk about different aspects of narrative from a reader's point of view, as well as it might be useful from a writer's point of view.
I first met AP in 2023 in Orlando, Florida, after his own videos lured me to the International Conference for the Fantastic in the Arts. You have to say it like that. I don't make the rules. He was a bit busy when I caught him, so he said, "Have you ever met Steven Erikson?" And then he proceeded to lead me to my favorite author of all time. Yeah, I got distracted. As a young writer just returning to school, this conference was an amazing experience. I met so many awesome people. It really was a turning point for my publishing and writing journey. But all that is a story for another video. Back in November, I got to talk to AP about fantasy and editing, and I learned so much from our conversation. Hey, these videos aren't sponsored, so I'd appreciate it if you checked out my publication, The Literary Fantasy Magazine. It's a biannual journal dedicated to character-driven fantasy. If you're a writer, submissions for issue 2 are open now. If you're a reader, issue 1 is available in paperback and Kindle on Amazon, or you could find a PDF and EPUB on our website. You can download a free sample by signing up for our newsletter. Alright, back to the video. Usually something like this would be more of like a podcast, but during the recording of the interview, I was in a rush. I was like on my lunch break and I had this allotted time to talk with AP, but I failed to record my own voice. I think my input was muted on OBS Studio, but that's okay because that limitation gave me the idea to do a more narrative cut down version for the YouTube channel. And here what I'll be doing is instead of a podcast, you're going to be hearing a little bit of me reenacting my asking questions, and you'll hear AP's responses. But seriously, this was such a great talk. We went over a lot of amazing information. AP is one of the most brilliant people I think I've ever spoke with. It was a very humbling and enlightening experience to have about a nice hour and a half of his time to just talk. And he was very kind and very informative the whole time.
Hi, I'm Dr. A.P. Canavan. I have a PhD in fantasy literature. I have an MA in science fiction literature, a BA in English literature, and a BA in jurisprudence. Initially started training as a lawyer and then went back to university because I rapidly found out that, unlike Perry Mason, not all the clients were going to be innocent. And that was a bit difficult for me to deal with. So I went back, I retrained because I loved narrative. I loved how stories functioned. And quite often when we discuss story, we get so wrapped up in the individual details that we miss these beautiful patterns. And I'm not talking about Freytag's pyramid, as wonderful as a 19th century narrative paradigm is, but the wonderful patterns that develop through narrative, what it can teach us about ourselves, about the author, to give us insight into different ways to look at life. And so much of our lives are shaped by story, whether it's news that is narrativized or an event that a particular narrative spin has been placed on it. The utilization of language to shape our perception of reality. And narrative is at the heart of all that. It's the study that I enjoyed the most. And so as part of that, I have moved to the US. I am now teaching at a college, but I also have a YouTube channel where I talk about narrative, where I do close readings, where I talk about different aspects of narrative from a reader's point of view, as well as it might be useful from a writer's point of view. Narrative is communication. And within that communication, you always have the person who is doing the communicating. The narrative itself is the communication, and then you have the receiver, the reader. And understanding that entire dynamic, knowing how readers perceive things, knowing how authors create things, it's not about establishing a hierarchy of who is right about any interpretation. It's about understanding the process and how seeing it from the different perspectives can give us greater insight into the things that influence us and actually shape our perception of the story itself, but then applying it in that more general, abstract way to shaping our perception of reality itself. That's what I do.
Given your background, can you still be surprised by a story?
Oh yeah, of course. Because and I sometimes say this quite facetiously, but I mean it with the greatest of respect and love. Authors are tricksy liars, and you can't trust them. And as soon as anyone comes up with, well, this is what the thing is, this is how the pattern develops, and we see this with trends within genres and subgenres. We see this with the different structures that get employed. Boy meets girl, boy loses girl, boy gets girl back. That then once that becomes established, we then have a subversion, and then we have a subversion of the subversion, and then we have a new look at it, and an inversion of the subversion of, and every time something like this develops, some sneaky lying author is going to come along and find a new way to do it. And that is always exciting. And every author has their own particular way of doing it, where, you know, you could look at, say, Joe Abercrombie's writing and how he uses very heavy focalization to shape the very perception of the story world, because each character is going to perceive that world differently. And, you know, we could perhaps suggest that maybe that's because of his psychological training, that he's more aware of that effect. And so he utilizes that to a great extent. You could look at Stephen Erickson and how he used a lot of short story writing techniques to build a 10-book epic fantasy series that is composed of a huge number of these little short stories all the way through. That authors approach things in different ways, and styles come in and out of fashion. Like one of the series that I've been reading and really greatly enjoying was Johnny Wirtz's The Wars of Light and Shadow. And Wirtz utilizes a style which for a lot of modern readers is too, what is it? They call it purple prose, but what they mean is highly descriptive and stylized. And it is so wonderful and evocative. And regardless of whether or not we are particular fans of that style, reading all of these different things means that we never know where one particular author is coming from, how they have absorbed all of the different narrative techniques that they've been exposed to, be it from film or TV, or other genres than the genre that they're writing in. And there is a wonderful synthesis and amalgam of these different techniques that each author brings their level of individuality to, which means even if you are aware of patterns, you can still be surprised. And it's wonderful. It's wonderful to be surprised. And then when you are surprised, to go back and go, how did they do that? And then to try and pick it all apart. And that's part of the joy of reading for me.
How important is it for a story to be original?
Surprise, innovation, uh, any of those elements of always trying to be new. You know, there's the old saw, there's nothing new under the sun. And you know, you have, oh, there's only 5 types of stories, there's only 7 types of stories, there's only 12 types, depending on which narrative breakdown they're using. But in all of these things, novelty is not the be all and end all, because a story well told is a story well told. And if that is the thing that brings you joy, if that's the thing that captures your imagination, then that has to be celebrated as well. And just because something is new doesn't necessarily make it good. Just because it is a subversion, like subversion for subversion's sake, is quite often one of the weakest things to find in a novel. because it almost telegraphs itself and it feels like a bit of a letdown. But when an author has their perception of what the story should be doing and it's consistent all the way through, and when you look back on it, you realize that that subversion, we should have seen it coming. That can be phenomenal. But, in a creative writing class, you'll always be like, one of the old saws is show, don't tell, right? Everyone is familiar with that. And in essence, that is basically to steer people away from, don't just dictate to your reader, this happened, then that happened, then that happened. Let them experience the narrative as it is occurring. That's kind of what it means. But quite often people misinterpret it as, well, I have to show things happening, not tell people that they're happening. And then, the moonlight reflected off the broken glass on the pavement. Well, you just told me that the moonlight reflected off the broken glass on the, you're like, that's not what it means. It's instead of saying it was night and the moon was shining, it's to try and create a picture of it that the reader can immerse themselves in. And so one of the beautiful things about the sheer variety of literature that we have is that no matter what our preferences are, there's something that's going to cater to it. And particularly within the fantasy genre, there are a lot of exceptionally popular authors who rely very heavily on exposition. And it's these big info dumps. And they break up scenes by suddenly, here's a whole load of information for the reader. And in a creative writing program, someone's going to say, that's bad. You shouldn't do that. And to be honest, like, it is a very blunt technique. But on the other hand, some readers really enjoy that. It is easier for a reader to understand. And so you can have massively popular authors who write in a way that if they were teaching a creative writing course, they would never tell their students to do, because it's a blunt, very unwieldy, inelegant way to write. And yet readers respond to it, because why are readers reading? Regardless of their level of literacy, they're reading to be entertained. They're reading to relax. They're reading because it's a hobby. And not everyone has to be engaging in reading and literary exercises to enjoy this. You look at Dan Brown. Like, Dan Brown is not an author whose style I would recommend that people try to emulate. But at the same time, Dan Brown was extraordinarily successful. Why is that? Why are the rules of good writing so different from presumably popular writing? And it's appealing to different things, to different audiences, to different sets of people. We have the same in cinema, the idea of cinema and film as an art form, but also a big blockbuster that is by the numbers and it has lots of special effects and it's fun and exciting. And it's a great way to while away 2 hours. Not everything has to be a cinematic masterpiece, just as not everything has to be a literary masterpiece. There is room in the market for all of these things, that we hopefully can find audiences who will respond to what is being created, the stories being told.
What would you say is the purpose of fantasy literature?
The purpose of fantasy literature is exactly the same as the purpose of any literature. It's to create art in the form of narrative. Just because it's in a genre of fantasy as opposed to the genre of science fiction or of horror or of literary fiction. If we took the same attitude to literary fiction that we quite often see about fantasy or, say, science fiction, we would say things like, oh, do we really need one more story about an up-and-coming author who's struggling to make ends meet in a garret in New York? And the people they meet in their everyday lives. Have we not already read that? Oh, it's not New York. Is it London this time? Wow, that's original. That we could make the same snide and facetious and flippant remarks about literary fiction, that it is intense navel gazing, solely there for the purpose of the author. But that would be a massive disservice to the beautiful writing that literary fiction can encompass. Just as within fantasy, there is incredible writing. There's a range. The idea that fantasy has to be either literary or not, they're all different expressions of literary narratives. And we can go towards the more art side of the spectrum, or we can go more towards the they're simply for entertainment. And I mean that like it is just entertainment. That doesn't mean that we can't have art that is also entertaining. But sometimes there is stuff that is produced that it isn't particularly good. It isn't particularly well written. It isn't particularly engaging, but it does the thing that it is meant to do, which is entertain its readers. And if that is a significant part of the genre, then it deserves to be explored. I think the old dichotomy about literary fiction and genre fiction, I'm somewhat frustrated by that because we don't have that attitude about classic fantastical literature. We don't go, oh, Milton's Paradise Lost. Well, that's not a realist text. We don't talk about A Midsummer Night's Dream and go, well, it would have been better if Shakespeare hadn't put magic and fairies in it. We don't make those distinctions because they have lasted the test of time. But we won't know what is going to last the test of time from the current era or epoch because we're not going to be around to find out. We have no idea what the future is going to hold. And so this whole idea that it must be great art, you go, but there's wonderful art all around us. And art in and of itself, writing in and of itself, teaches us about ourselves. It teaches us about our world. It allows us to inhabit different perspectives. It can console us. It can be cathartic. We can rage against it. It serves so many different purposes. If you think of Martin Amos's Time's Arrow, spoiler alert for Time's Arrow, but because the narrative is flowing backwards, we identify with this character and the quite sardonic voice of the narrator. And then we find out the origins of that character, the monster that he was. And we think, how could we have identified with him before we knew that? That knowledge suddenly comes out, and we realize that people can do monstrous acts. People can be monsters, but they're also people at the same time. And if we're unaware of the monstrosity, if the monstrosity is hidden from us, we won't automatically know. And it is a wonderful challenge to the fact that we always think that the most evil people in the world are going to be these cartoon villains who are easily recognizable. And yet they can appear perfectly normal and yet do these things that are so incredibly, insidiously evil. Just on the flip side, we might misjudge someone who is an inherently good person. And Time's Arrow would not have been as interesting a novel had it not played around with the perception of time in that way, if it had not reversed the flow of time, which is something you could see quite often. Well, not quite often, but you see more frequently in things like science fiction. Science fiction can extrapolate about the impact of technology. Science fiction can extrapolate about different social constructs, different governments. We venerate things like 1984, and we call it dystopian fiction because we don't want to get that icky science fiction tag attached to it. Oh, we couldn't do that. Fahrenheit 451. Oh, that's dystopian. It's not science fiction. Oh, so it was set in the future about a social science, but it's not science fiction. And people then think about fantasy that it is retrograde, that is always looking to the past and celebrating a simpler time. And yet fantasy is always written in the present day. It uses what is happening around us today to create these stories. And so it will still have resonance about what is going on in the world around us. Maybe not as overtly and as distinctly as something that is written specifically about that. But like one of the examples I like to give is Raymond E. Feist's Magician, which in America was Magician Apprentice and Magician Master, but in the UK was published as a single volume. And I think it was like 1988. And he has three male protagonists. All of the good male characters espouse quite obvious feminist qualities in that, you shouldn't dismiss women. Women need to be respected. Women should be treated as equals. And yet the story world that this is set in is intensely patriarchal, does not recognize that women can inherit titles and that if they get married, their husband gets the power. And so you have these three characters who are meant to be part of this world, espousing values that directly contradict the world that they are in. And so we ask ourselves, well, why is it there then? It's clearly not to make the world more believable. It's clearly not to make the story world more real, because they are acting and saying things in direct contradiction to the world. But no one is challenging them on it. No one questions the fact that they say this. And the reason it's there is, well, Feist didn't want his characters being misogynists. So even though the world is actually quite misogynistic, the characters aren't. And it makes it easier for the readership to identify with them as good characters. Because, a normal person does not regard a woman as a second-class citizen who shouldn't be allowed to inherit. And therefore, if you're trying to create a good character, a heroic character, and you have them espouse something that the current generation of readers would wildly object to, that's a rod for your own back. And so even in something like Feist's Magician, which a lot of people would say, there's a lot of exposition in it. It's following a lot of the traditional tropes of epic fantasy. Even that is very much incorporating the politics of its day when it was written in order to respond and engage with its readership. And so to suggest that fantasy, for some reason, because it likes its castles and sword fights and magic, can't be interesting to engage with is, I think, missing the point about the different perspectives that readers have on these things. That it's not always about agreeing that, oh yeah, well, this is about kings and kings are great and we should go back to having kings. That by providing the contrast quite often, it helps us rethink our criticisms or even our praises for modern systems. And that's what literature does. Like all literature does this.
Tell me about your editing. Are you still doing your freelance practice?
Yeah. Oh, I've been a freelance developmental editor for about 15 years now. I still do that. I just with changing day jobs recently, I've had to scale back, but I'm about to ramp back up again now that I've sort of settled into my position. But yeah, I've been working as a freelance developmental editor for about 15 years. Yeah, occasionally short stories and short story collections, but usually novels. Like my I suppose the thing that I spend a lot of time doing is understanding fantasy. So long novels for a start, because let's face it, I don't think any other genre likes its chunky books as much as fantasy does. But also series and serial, that there are different narrative structures and paradigms that apply across a serial or apply across a series that a lot of writing workshops and writing programs don't necessarily address, because they're so focused, because of time constraints, on the creation of short stories or one longer project of a novel. But the idea of creating a narrative that stretches over multiple volumes and how we deal with the peaks and troughs of dramatic interest, or where we are putting in to use Freytag again, rising action, falling action, where we're putting in various climaxes. And a lot of that, I think, perhaps more so in the modern day, I think a lot of younger writers draw their inspiration from TV shows because TV shows are the major sort of narrative paradigm example that they have of a serial. And yet, books function differently in a number of respects. And if you're using a TV show format, it doesn't necessarily work as well as a novel, and vice versa. Using a novel structure to make a TV show, it quite often fails quite badly.
When you're working on those contracts, what does your day-to-day process look like?
First of all, because it's freelance, quite often it is almost seasonal in that, people will contact me and say, do you have time in your schedule? Like, well, how long is your novel, or how long is your project? And you have to budget time on that. And I look at my schedule about where I can fit it in. But the actual procedure for each thing that you go through is roughly the same. So that my process for it quite often is I ask for a relatively short sample of writing from a client. And I will do a read through of the short sample, give feedback on it in exactly the way that I would do with a longer project. And I send it back to them and I do it for free. And the reason being, they have to be comfortable with trusting me with their work, but also are going to get something valuable from how I approach things. And therefore, getting some feedback on a shorter piece, usually from the start of a novel, just give me the first couple of scenes. Or the prologue or chapter 1. I'll go through it, give feedback. If they don't like how I approach it, if they don't like the type of feedback I give, it saves them investing time and money in hiring me. At the same time, for me, it's incredibly invaluable because usually from a sample, you can see the potential issues that may arise. And therefore, you're better able to budget time for it, knowing if X is going to be an issue or Y is going to be an issue or how often various things are going to come up. And you learn to recognize this quite quickly with authors writing. And so it's a very useful preliminary exercise just to get an idea of how long any sort of project is going to take. And then, we usually then set up a call, have a short chat about the initial work, whether or not they're happy working with me. We get around to talking about the budget and how much it's going to cost and the time scale. And once all that's done, this is when I'll be doing it. I have budgeted this time. And, we go from there. But because you have such a variety of projects, like someone can send you a 250,000 word novel, or someone can send you a 75,000 word novel. And they will have completely different structures. They will have completely different aspects about them. They may be intended for different audiences. And so knowing what the project is, you're able to respond to it in a way that is going to be useful for that author. So the day-to-day is almost always project dependent.
Hey, quick interjection. I just wanted to mention that these next set of questions about editing were extremely informative to me. They actually shaped the way that I look at editing now in the last few months. At The Arcanist, we were having some discussions about voice of the editor. See, all of us are students, and we're all doing publishing for the first time. So a lot of things in regards to editing are we're kind of just learning as we go. So to hear his perspective and his process, the ethics that he brings to editing was invaluable to me. And so I really want you to pay attention to AP's answers in the following sections if you are interested in editing. And even if you're just a writer who needs to improve your self-editing, this is something to pay attention to. When you're editing a story, how much of your own voice do you think makes it into the final product?
Well, no. For a start, every project is always the author's. It's always their voice. It's always what they are trying to do. There should never be an element of my voice in any of their writing. Um, what I typically do on a developmental pass is I highlight areas. I may make suggestions in the commentary of this is a potential issue, this is one way it could be solved, this is a different way it could be solved. I do not change the writing itself. I might highlight things. I might occasionally I will fix, you do various line edits where you would get rid of typos, where you would fix misspelled words, like you would change grammar sometimes when it is obvious within the exposition or within the narration that it should be the other way. But you always track changes, you always leave it up to the author because the author has to be able to go through and say, yeah, I'm okay with that. Because I generally work on as a developmental editor, this is before the final draft. And therefore, it's usually looking for a lot of the structural issues or that sort of thing. So having commentary all the way down the side. Quite often at the end of a chapter, having a write-up about the chapter, about key points that occurred in it, whether or not it agrees or disagrees with things that have happened in the past, what it's potentially signaling, making all those sorts of notes. And then your whole editorial write-up, because you're looking at it as a functioning narrative. Does it have a beginning, middle, and end? Is it meant to have a beginning, middle, and an end? Looking at these sorts of structures, is it achieving closure or is it dropping plot threads? Do character actions make sense? Is character psychology consistent or inconsistent? Is it potentially, it appears inconsistent, but it could potentially be consistent if this is flagged earlier and that is flagged earlier. It's putting all of these different pieces together because one of the things that I think we all struggle with is in our writing, we know what it is meant to be communicating. We have all that information at the back of our head. So we will look at a sentence and go, it is clear what this sentence means. But as in the great advantage of having any editor is that they will look at it and they don't have the knowledge that's at the back of your head. And therefore they look at it and go, I have no idea what this sentence is meant to mean. It could mean X, Y, or Z. And because of that, it's a fresh pair of eyes that can look at your manuscript, that is being respectful about the work that you're trying to do, is trying to engage with it on its merits, not about imposing, well, this is what's currently popular in the marketplace, or this is the new trend, or this is what I would like to see more of. It's never about that. It's always about this is the story that this author wants to tell. How can I help this author tell that story better? How can it reach its audience? How can it communicate more effectively? Are there things that are ambiguous that could be cleared up? Should they remain ambiguous? Is something too obvious and actually needs to be disguised? And every single project is radically different because authors are telling their individual stories. They're not writing to a pattern. Oh yeah, and once the manuscript is marked up, once the editorial letter has been written and sent back, the author sits with it. They go through it, they look at the notes, they look at all, and then we schedule another call, and we sit for sometimes multiple hours while we argue about stuff. But ultimately, nothing I say or do or note, none of that has to be taken on board by the author. It is their story, 100%. They have ownership of it. Their name is going on it. And they may disagree with me. I've had those arguments with authors, those discussions where we've talked about it. And I've said, but you are going to run it. And they're like, well, I'm okay with that risk. And you're like, brilliant, fantastic. I've done my job. I've highlighted the thing that may be an issue. You're aware of the issue. You've evaluated it and you're okay to proceed. As long as you know that, it's your story. Stand behind it. And I have worked with people where I have suggested something here or something there because of a potential issue. And they said, no, 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 I'm staying with it. And then every once in a while, we'll look at reviews and I'll see a review where they complain about the very thing that I highlighted. But that doesn't make me right because there may be a whole load of other reviews that don't mention it at all. The author could have been right to keep that in. And that's the beauty of it. None of us can ever predict how a book is going to land, how a story is going to resonate with readers. No one can do it. And it doesn't matter how experienced someone is in the field. You can work on probabilities, you can work on your knowledge of the field, but you honestly do not know if a book is going to take off. Like, look at Harry Potter. Harry Potter was not a phenomenon when the first book was released. It wasn't a phenomenon when the second book released. It became a phenomenon with the third book. And then people went back and, as it gathered up, more people were buying book one and two. But it wasn't a massive success with the very first book. It was successful, like, don't get me wrong, but it wasn't the worldwide phenomenon that it became. No one could have predicted that because we can look at earlier books like the Worst Witch series, which, very, very similar, if for a slightly younger audience. We could look at a lot of the school days novels or those sorts of magic school stories. None of them took off the same way. But for some reason, Harry Potter just struck the right spark at the right time in the right place. And that's what took off. No one could have predicted that.
Are there any past projects you've worked on that you're especially proud of?
Yes.
Could you elaborate?
No. One of the things that is very, very important to me as an editor is that regardless of anything else, an author can trust me with their work. I do not talk about their work unless they expressly ask me about it. I don't reveal any notes that I gave about their work unless an author expressly says, oh, by the way, AP did this. But I don't talk about it because it's not my work. It's their story. And it is important to me that no one ever, ever thinks that the reason the story is good is because I worked on it. You go, no, the reason the story is good is this author sweated blood and tears and time and effort to create this wonderful narrative. All I did was I came in, poked at it a little bit, nudged it here and there, gave it back to the author. They then went through it again and they created something. So it's weird because it's one of those things. I wish I could brag about stuff. I go, oh yeah, I've read this and it's really, really good. You're like, no, I know other people do. Other people don't have a problem with it, but it's not how I work and it's not how I approach it. And I hope that the authors I work with appreciate it and it works for them. Because, there are some authors who I've worked with and they've talked about things that I've done to their work. And I still don't comment on it, even though I go, that's a slight mischaracterization of what I said. Yeah, whatever. It's their book. They can say what they want. It's also probably not the most commercially savvy. But at the same time, fundamentally, the person who created the story, the person who created the art, that's the person we should respect. Not the person who came in and corrected a slight tilt to the easel as they were painting their picture. That's all. An editor helps. An editor is there as a support. An editor is there to help steady the hand at a certain place. But ultimately, the art that is created is 100% the art of that author. And as a principle, that's the one that I stand behind. And I find it easier to do that than to go, well, maybe I'll talk about this little bit, because that incremental erosion of it, that line would be very hard to maintain. Whereas, you know what? I don't talk about the feedback I give authors, or I don't talk about specific works. it's a personal quirk, maybe. When you think of the amount of time and effort that goes into writing a novel, it's some staggering figure, like 98 or 99% of all authors never recoup anything close to the amount of time, effort, and money that they spent on it. It's a staggering failure rate, so to speak, if you're looking at it purely in commercial terms. But we don't, because ultimately you look at it and go, it's not a failure because you created the story. Just because it didn't sell, the value of the narrative is not in its sales. You spent this time, this effort to create art, and you succeeded in creating the art. Did it achieve the grand audience that you had hoped? No, but you still succeeded in creating the art. And I think that's, in this day and age, it can be very easy to get swept up in that. Well, I didn't make these sales or that. And I feel that we're losing sight of the achievement it is for someone to sit down and create a compelling narrative and completing it. Like actually, how many people out there have gone, oh, I've always wanted to write a book, and they have page 1 of something or the first 2 chapters of something. And some people have 30 or 40 first chapters of something that they have never, ever finished it. And yet there are other people out there who have created an entire novel. And that is an achievement. That is something to be celebrated. But as you no doubt know, when someone sends in a story and you're looking at it, as an editor, like you might go through, you might suggest some changes, or you might highlight something, send it back to them and go, listen, these would be changes that I would suggest that you make. But if the author didn't want to change them, and you said, well, okay, either we accept it or we don't, it still has to be up to the author. It's still their work, their vision. And, sometimes you no doubt find as well, there maybe is a story or a narrative that is not to your personal taste. And you go, yeah, like I wouldn't choose to read this if it wasn't my job. I haven't been particularly entertained. You're like, great. Is it a good story? Oh, it is a fabulous story. Like it's really well written. It has all of these things. Because taste and preference and enjoyment, like these things, they're highly, highly individualized. But when we look at it in terms of what it is doing and how it is doing it, there is a separation between the personal and the professional. And despite what websites like Goodreads maybe would suggest, there is actually a separation between enjoying something and something being good. Or not enjoying something and something being bad. Those are not direct equivalents. If we're talking solely about our reader experience, then yes, that is rooted in the personal. But there are plenty of books out there that we can appreciate the beauty of them, the beauty of the writing, the intricacy of the characterization and the characters, or the wonderful patterns of the plot and how the world comes together, or how evocative it is. Like there are all of these different elements that we can appreciate. Whether or not we go, oh yeah, I want to read that again immediately because I really enjoyed that. Like that, we always want that, but that's not what we get when you work in the field. Sometimes you read things that you go, this is not my cup of tea, but it is a very well made cup of tea. And that's the point of being a professional. If you think of the process of writing, so many people believe that, you sit down and your muse contacts you, and then through your fingertips, this beautiful thing appears on the screen, or through your hand and the pen on the paper. And that, that's what writing is. And you know what? Maybe some days it is like that. But the vast majority of the time, it is us banging our head repeatedly at a keyboard to create something. And then the next day going, right, let me fix this. And writing, like so many things, is an iterative process. It's, yes, you need to get the initial stuff down, but also then it is going through and going, right, I have my rough outline of this statue I have carved out of this block of marble. Now I need to start to refine it. Now I need to polish it in this area. Now I need to do this. And oh, I've accidentally broken off an arm. Right. So let's turn this into a wing. And it is an iterative process of going back again and again. And it will never, ever, ever be perfect. And I think more people need to hear this. It will never be perfect. But what you're aiming for is not, is it good enough to, you're aiming for that thing. Is this now communicating what I want to communicate? Is it doing it effectively? Have I polished it? And now this is the best form that I am capable of doing. Because you will never reach every reader. You will never cater to every reader's preference. We very rarely can cater to all of our own individual preferences. It can never be absolutely perfect. But what you need is something beyond, well, it's good enough. And before I'm going to drive myself mad trying to fix this one comma. That there is space between those 2 points. And that is it communicating what I want to communicate in a way that is effective and beautiful and will hopefully resonate with the people that read it? And if you can find an editor or a friend or a group of other writers who can help you do that, very rarely is what they're going to suggest as the fix be the actual thing. Almost invariably, what they suggest will not work. However, by highlighting the problem, by giving a potential solution, you will understand the problem better because you see how they are trying to solve it. And that will allow you as the artist to find your own unique way of approaching it. And what you create in that moment is going to be better than anything they suggest. And it is going to be better than the original because you're improving on the original. But it doesn't have to be perfect. It is never going to be perfect.
Thank you for making it to the end of the video. If you found this helpful or informative, I'd really appreciate it if you liked and subscribed. And while you're at it, go ahead and subscribe to A Critical Dragon. You won't be disappointed. This one was a time investment to create, but I think it was well worth it. Either way, we have another video coming in 2 weeks, so I'll see you then.